Our final topic this term is going to bring together some of the discussions we've already had relating to age and aging. So we can begin by looking at how anthropologists have studied aging. They've looked at this from several different perspectives, and some of these we will talk about, including the process of aging, the status and treatment of the age. Others have looked at the cultural knowledge the aged possess. We're not going to talk about that too much, but we will talk about the life experience of elderly people. And we're not going to focus on just the aged and elderly as well. We're also going to look at youth briefly. Oops, too fast. Okay. So let's take this four-field approach and let's start with biological anthropology and biology, and let's start at the beginning with human childbirth. Now, again, I'm going to try to summarize the notes here. I know it's the end of the term. I know our brains are tired from learning, but I wanted to hit a few points here. First is that we acknowledge that we are born, right? We are mammals. And so we have to think about how our biology has been shaped by the process of childbirth and also how childbirth has shaped our biology, right? So we've talked about sex estimation using the human pelvis, and we've looked at how we see modifications in the female pelvis in order to facilitate labor and delivery, right? And part of this means that we have this trade-off between the size of the infant cranium, and the size of the pelvic opening itself. Too big of a pelvic opening, we're not able to walk bipedally. And there's other structural issues with that, but too big of a cranium, and then it can't be delivered safely through the birth canal either. So we need to have this balance between a large head and in a small form, and a large pelvis, but one that still allows us to walk bipedally. So what this means is that generally speaking, our infants are born dependent upon us for a prolonged period of time, right? Unlike other mammals or even other primates, we're not looking at months or a couple of years, but decades before a child is able to go off on their own as an adult in our cultures. And we've already looked at how labor and delivery is shaped by our cultures. So once we're born, then we enter a phase in which we can start to track, and actually even before we're born, while we're in the fetal phase, and developing, we can chart and measure our growth and development. And this is often seen in the form of numerous doctor appointments that we have to undergo during the pregnancy, but also post-pregnancy as well. So when the infant is born, to track this, to ensure that its brain and head is developing appropriately, that its overall growth and weight is within the average acceptable range. And then as we age, this process of tracking our growth and development slows down a little bit until we hit puberty, and then we get some other biological landmarks that we can follow and track. And so we kind of have these known stages, at least initially, where a lot of it is based on our biology. But post-puberty, and the transition particularly from adolescence into adulthood, is one that is less of a biological shift and more of a cultural shift, right? We've already looked at some of these stages or some of these rites that are used to mark this transition from one stage from adolescence to adult. The other stage that is trickier to capture biologically, although typically is, and we'll talk about this, is a period of kind of almost breakdown of our biology a little bit, rather than growth, is a period of kind of decay, as it were, is that into old age, right? And what I want to emphasize here is this last point, that it's important because it shows that we divide our life experience into categories by age, meaning that we give different values to different ages as well, right? We've learned that by dividing people into different genders and different sexes and different sexualities means that we give them different values based on their experiences. So the same is true for age as well. So let's look at some of these transitions then. Let's look at post-puberty aging. So we see a change in sensory abilities, and we talked about these in our Collaborate session. An overall decline in taste, smell, touch, sight, and hearing, right? So all kind of diminish as we age, but not equally in everyone, not even equally within an individual, right? Some people might lose their sense of smell, but not their sense of hearing, or some people might lose their hearing and their sight, but not their taste and smell. Right? Our bodies have all these different ways of compensating for it, but overall speaking, we definitely see a diminishment as we age versus in our youth. Of course, we see observable physical changes such as graying of the hair, wrinkling of the skin, changes in the skin texture and skin color. We do see an overall decline in strength and vitality. So this is where, again, doctor appointments tend to increase a lot as we age, as we start to want to track things like bone density, for example, to ensure that we're not losing the density of our bone, which will cause a further decline in our health as we age, right? Because more brittle bones, more likely to break. Once you start breaking bones, then you have medical interventions, and this can decrease quality of life. But of course, all of these are going to vary greatly on individual. There's so many different genetic, social, and environmental factors that influence it. But again, typically speaking, aging is universal to all humans, and we all experience some indications of post-puberty aging. When we think about aging, then we often think about it, especially from our culture, where we privilege youth and the vitality and the energy and the heightened senses that are associated with youth. We tend to think about prevention of aging and also prevention of dying as well. And so I talk about below the research of Dong et al. That suggests that we've already kind of reached our maximum life expectancy with biomedical intervention. And there's a number of reasons for this, but it all comes down to, again, senescence, this pre-programmed cellular death, this pre-programmed aging that we have as biological organisms, right? So if we want to continue to expend our lifespans, now we're going to have to almost get into the realm of science fiction. So things like Elon Musk's Neuralink. Of course, a lot of these ways we've studied aging in humans, and some of the preventive measures have also looked at aging in primates. And I talked about the study that was done by Pelveca in the Collaborate session, and some of my concerns about raising this. But the key here, and we saw this with Zuck as well, is that we can use animal models, but we must use them cautiously. We must think about the kinds of primates we are studying. But we also have to think about then, how does the information we obtain from primate studies, non-human primate studies, translate into humans, right? And so Pelveca talks about that there's 3 elements of human aging that appear to be absent in the Japanese macaques that she studied. So we have menopause, awareness of mortality, and inter-individual dependence. So while they may show very similar biological signs of aging, from a kind of cultural perspective, their experiencing of aging is very different. And we talked about a lot of these reasons in the Collaborate session. It was the Chemnitz et al. One was the one that I kind of hesitate sometimes to share with students, because it involves calorie restriction. And of course, our culture, we have a bias towards things like body modification through dieting. We have these ideas of ideal forms, and we have some problematic understandings of body as health, right? Of body as wellness, and what healthy bodies should look like. But it's important to note that one of the things that has been shown is that calorie restriction does appear to decrease the visibility and experience of classic aging symptoms. So things like hair loss and muscle tone and stuff like that do not seem to be as severe in primates that have calorie reduction. So you can read the study, but again, take it with a note of caution, because it is primate-based and not human-based. So we talked, we have talked extensively in this course about menarche, about the changes of puberty, about pregnancy, but what about the other side of things, about menopause? And again, this is one of the interesting things that comes out of the Pelveca study, is that, again, humans are kind of unique in that we have the luxury, as it were, of living long enough to experience menopause, or living beyond our reproductive age. And so there's a lot of questions then around, why does menopause occur? And a lot of the benefits of going through menopause and living past our reproductive ages as both males and females seems to connect with just kind of what we call the kind of grandparenting hypothesis, which is that both elderly individuals and young individuals benefit from interaction with each other. And a traditional role of elders in many cultures is childcare. And so there's a societal benefit for living past our reproductive age, that basically we can assist, not necessarily in terms of labor, subsistence labors, but in terms of supporting the next generation, right? So this is really important. We'll look at this a little bit further in one of our readings for this topic. I also posted some information below about how even the symptoms of aging vary by gender and also by culture. So I have a few notes about PMS, how that is experienced cross-culturally, and then Eva Gee's work on menopause and the transmission of women's knowledge shows that indeed how women experience menopause is shaped by the stories that are told to them by other women in their culture. And that if in cultural groups where elder women do share their experience of menopause openly with younger women, the younger women feel more empowered as they age. They don't see aging as negative, but women in other groups who do not get this kind of cultural transmission of menopause symptoms and treatments from their elders find menopause a lot more traumatic of an experience. Okay. On the male side of things, I wanted to present you the work of Wenzel et al. And this is one of our readings for this work, looking at erectile dysfunction and how, again, culture shapes and transforms the understanding of what masculine or male sexuality should look like over time. And simply what she concludes here, although I'd like you to look at this reading a little bit more detailed and consider it for the final exam, is that essentially what she found is that there is a shift from kind of a youthful sexuality into a mature masculinity focused on home and family. So the idea is that if erectile dysfunction is experienced by an older male, he sees it as a sign that, okay, his young, youthful, sexually active days are now coming into decline, which means he needs to focus on being a father and a husband and less on sexual conquest. Of course, there are some interesting other side points regarding this around, again, how heterosexuality and heteronormativity is reinforced through these narratives. The idea of sexuality being dependent on penetrative sex, for example, all of these different things are incorporated into this reading, and this is why it's valuable to look at. But again, what all of these studies so far have shown is that aging is an embodied process, right? And it's linked very closely with our gender. And then I go on, and in the slides here, I talk a little bit about the difference between age grades and age sets. And so this is kind of different cultural approaches to understanding the stages through which we proceed through aging. And I give the Maasai of Tanzania as an example. So we've talked about the Maasai quite a bit in this course. We've had a reading looking at early marriage amongst the Maasai. We've looked at circumcision amongst the Maasai, and now we're looking at age sets within the Maasai. So I already talked about, sorry, this should have been earlier in the presentation, but about how while the process of aging is biological, clearly what all of these readings and all of the information I present to this point show us is that aging and our experience of aging is heavily influenced by our culture, right? So how old we are does vary significantly based on our own perspective within our own cultural group, right? And so we talked about this in Collaborate, how even though I'm very rapidly approaching 40 here, I don't see 40 as old anymore. But when I was young, like my daughter, 7.5 years old, I thought 40 was ancient, right? Like 40 was like grandparent ages. And now I'm like, hey, I want to make it to 100. I probably won't be old until I'm well into my 80s, hopefully, knock on wood. One of the other points that I wanted to revisit by talking about aging is status. And so we do know that status changes as we age. It's part of the reason why proceeding through the various stages of life are marked with rites of passage, is because it's marking that change in status that occurs. So recall again the importance of of rites of passage. When we look at the elderly cross-culturally, again, the experience of being elderly and the definition of what an elder person is and what their status is varies significantly cross-culturally. But we do see, again, universally a change in status as we age. With many societies, we see an increase in status as we age. In other societies, we see a decline. But I will note that, of course, from an intersectional approach, what we see is that, typically speaking, the status of older women doesn't increase to the same rate that it does of older men. And there's a number of different ways that our society, for example, reflects this value we have, where we value kind of older males, but not older females. Again, this is not a cross-cultural universal, but relatively speaking, aging is not seen as beneficial for women in terms of their status as it is for males. So I mentioned this already, that one of the universal roles for elderly individuals is seen as babysitting, and in particular, the survival of postmenopausal women is extremely important for the welfare and survival of grandchildren. But there's consequences of this in terms of other cultures, in terms of how we treat elders, where elders live, their integration into family units. We talked about in Blackboard how I think one of the things that will come out of COVID for sure in our post-COVID world is we're going to see an increased number of multi-generational households here in the West, because we've seen that childcare, when it falls in the hands of parents, can be really challenging with the kind of demands of our economy and labor, right? Where it's hard to work and raise your children at the same time. And households that don't have that luxury may rely then on extended kin, including the aged individuals, elderly individuals within the society to help take care of kids. So our Tomei et al. Reading I mentioned is not an anthropological reading, but it's really interesting looking at the intersection of status and of economic status in terms of choice and agency, therefore power, that elderly people may have in terms of whether or not they get to live alone or not, right? And how, in this case, the study that comes out of Lebanon, that living alone is seen as kind of an ambivalent category. It can either mean that you have financial and psychological and physical independence, or it might actually represent that you're socially isolated and deprived, right? So, or have deprivation as a result of that social isolation. Basically, your family's not taking care of you. They're basically just sending you money so you can stay off on your own. So it's this kind of liminal space, as it were, in terms of status, right? So you kind of can be seen as like healthy and doing well financially, so you can afford to live on your own, or you can be seen as needy and dependent, but yet not capable of living with your family for whatever reason, so therefore it's being seen as lonely. So it has both kind of negatives and positive consequences. So again, I think there's some interesting anthropological approaches we can take to this data set. We can look at how, for example, they divided households into different kinds of groups and households based on what the composition was look like, how they what measures they use to establish the socioeconomic status of individuals. And then also, interestingly, they introduced some control variables, right? Because they wanted to look at the relationship between quality of health and living arrangements as well. And so what we see is that there's kind of no good choice that's here, right? That in many cases, individuals also don't have the ability to choose whether or not they do get to live alone as they age because their economic resources are insufficient to allow them to do that. I then want to switch over briefly and talk about children, because it's hard to talk about aging without talking about where we began. I think it's really also important because children are often invisible in the archaeological record and in other work as well. And so children also have, much like the elderly, restricted rights and limited ability in some degree. They have even less power or lack of power than the elderly do have. Right? They have, if we look at it from a linguistic perspective, fewer and more restricted conversational rights than adults. They're very unsuccessful in interruption, for example. We tend to hear older children more readily than younger children. But also the gender of children then also impacts their ability in conversations as well. So, and we can think about then some of the how we regulate their behaviors as well. So they often receive verbal or physical reprimands for violating the rules of cultural appropriateness, right? It's seen as part of their enculturation and socialization process. We can also think about some of the stereotypes negatively that are associated with teenagers in many cultures and societies. So again, aging, it becomes very important to look at it from this kind of intersectional approach as well, because again, of how gender relates how we understand and accept the behaviors of children and divide children into different categories, including, again, both juvenile and adolescent phases. We've looked at division of labor, and this is really critical, is that while our readings focused on the division of labor by adults, it did also mention in some cases when children are permitted or not permitted to engage in things like hunting or gardening or fishing. I mentioned this about aging around stereotyping, and we talked about this a little bit in the Collaborate session, so revisit this, but I also have notes below around how prejudice against elderly and children can be either benevolent, where we see them as kind of helpless and requiring our assistance, or it can be hostile, where we see them as a problem that must be addressed. And then the last point I wanted to make in this course relates to death. And I think it's appropriate to end at the end, as it were, but also acknowledging that not all death comes at the end of the cycle, which means that we have cultural perceptions around deaths that are seen as natural, deaths that are seen as not natural. But some anthropologists have argued that really death and mortuary rites are the most important rite of passage that we go through, because it's inevitable, right? That all of us must go through it, whereas all of the other ones in the middle vary significantly based on individual experiences and cultural experiences, right? But at the end of the day, all of us die. And so one of the reasons why I like to talk about this is because in our culture that we do, typically speaking, have a very strong bias away from talking about death. I think that's starting to change, of course, unfortunately, under COVID-19 and the very large number of individuals who are dying as a result of that virus. And so it's kind of, again, to me, bringing to our attention this idea of what is then considered natural. You might hear a lot of reports around things like comorbidities and stuff like that, and a lot of resistance against reporting that, because it's been argued that even though people have these underlying conditions, including being elderly, which is often cited as this kind of underlying condition, because for us in our culture, it's more acceptable to die when you are elderly, because the idea is that you've already lived your life, whereas child mortality is seen as much more significant, as kind of sadder, as a greater loss, etc. That again, our ideas around what is quote unquote a natural death is also being transformed quite radically by COVID-19. So I'd encourage you to, as we move forward through this pandemic and hopefully out of it, now that we have a vaccine at hand, is to think about this, is to think a little bit about how it has shaped your understanding of death, of dying. And also, it's highlighted the importance of mortuary rites, because there's been a lot of effort by the governments to ensure that people can still have funerals as a way of grieving and mourning. So it's really important here. And think about as well how new technologies are going to change our understanding. And I'll draw your attention to Black Mirror episode 4 in season 3, which is very critically acclaimed for issues around representation, but is really interesting because it talks about this very fundamental question of, well, what is actually death? What does it mean to die? And other shows are starting to challenge this as well. Okay. So that's it for content for this term. I wish you all the best of luck on your exams. And of course, as always, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact me.